All eyes are now on NATO leaders' July summit in the Lithuanian capital. Will it focus on Ukraine's push for accession to NATO?
Who will be the next US president? As Trump gears up to take on Biden, his deputy Pence calls him unfit. But it's DeSantis who is drumming up support. A dozen Republicans in the fray and counting. Will a crowded contest benefit Trump? Race for the White House on WION. World is One.
Gravitas tells you stories which others won't. And tonight we will tell you about this new strategic map that is being drawn.
They say your enemy's enemy is your friend. Is that the foundation of the new defense bridge between India and America?
This is what separates us from others who claim to be telling you global stories that matter. In the last 3 days, WION has been traveling across Syria. You are in Latakia city right now. Tell us, what is the situation on ground? At Gravitas, we don't just tell you stories from selected countries from around the world.
2 years since the Myanmar military coup, the people of Myanmar continue to live in a nightmare.
Because it does not suit their propaganda, or because they are too scared to speak truth to power.
Stay connected with the world through WION. Like the page on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter for new alerts. Instagram for videos and images. And the website for the latest news, views and analysis. WIONews.com. World is One.
Hi everyone, welcome to WION Live Broadcast from New York City. I'm Susan Tehrani. First, let's take a look at the latest stories making headlines this hour. Moscow warns that Kyiv could be preparing for a provocation at the Russian-controlled Zaporizhia nuclear plant, a flashpoint concern in the conflict in Ukraine. Meanwhile, Russia also says that it has not made a final decision about whether to extend the Black Sea grain deal, which is due to expire on July 17th. Canada, Britain, Sweden, and Ukraine have taken Iran to the International Court of Justice to seek damages for families of passengers on a jetliner downed by Tehran in 2020. Iran shot down a Ukraine international airline flight after takeoff from Iran, killing all 176 people on board. Turkey's annual inflation rate slows to 38.2% in June, although economists warn that this may be a low point for the year. Rare summer storms with wind speeds up to 145 kilometers per hour hits the Netherlands. One person is dead, several are injured as dozens of trees are toppled by the storm. Okay, let's start you off with the United Nations nuclear watchdog chief. He has finished a tour of the Fukushima nuclear plant. Rafael Grossi remains unchanged on his stance on the release of treated radioactive water into the sea. China and several Pacific islands still oppose the move. What are the concerns and what impact can release of the water potentially have on the people in the region? More in our next report.
A nod to Japan from the International Atomic Energy Agency to dump water from the wrecked Fukushima nuclear plant into the ocean. The plan is to release more than 1 million metric tons of treated radioactive water. IAEA Chief Rafael Grossi visited the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power station, and this is what he had to say.
I don't see any pending issue. Basically, of course, this is a complex operation, and there might be here and there some minor detail, but by and large, I think that all the basic elements are in place in case the government takes a decision to move forward with this.
The UN says the release meets international nuclear safety standards. Japan's neighbors raise concerns, calling for a more inclusive scientific method, leaving a big question mark on the completion of this gigantic task. The issue has its origins in 2011 in the powerful earthquake and tsunami that hit the Fukushima power plant. Attention had turned to the need to cool the fuel rods attached to the reactors. Japanese authorities used water. Since then, this water has been stored in huge tanks, and the volume of this water is mind-boggling. Enough to fill at least 500 Olympic-sized swimming pools is the estimate. According to the plant's operator TEPCO, plant workers have been filtering the contaminated water to remove isotopes. And the only thing which remains is a radioactive isotope of hydrogen known as tritium. TEPCO will dilute the water until tritium levels fall below regulatory limits. This will be done before the water is released into the Pacific. Tritium is considered a harmless enough element due to its inability to penetrate the human skin, but the concerns remain. A scientific article published in 2014 claims that when ingested, tritium can raise cancer risks. Now this brings us to the next part of our story. Fear among the people in the region has reached a new high, particularly around the aquatic life that may eventually affect humans. Some in South Korea are panic buying salt over fears of contamination after the discharge begins. The fishing communities in Fukushima are worried about the low footfall they will face due to the fear of radioactive substances. International pressure is also mounting. China says Japan cannot use the UN report as a pass to discharge the water. Representatives from the Pacific Islands are also urging Japan to consider the livelihoods the release may affect. Bureau Report, WION World is One.
Okay, well, for more on this, we are joined by Matthew L. Wald, a former policy analyst at the Nuclear Energy Institute, and he's joining us live from Washington, D.C. Matthew, thank you so much for joining us on WION. You know, I was listening to this report, and to a lesser extent, it reminds me of the BP oil spill in Louisiana some years ago, and how the fishermen there were so concerned and the shrimpers were so concerned that despite constant assurances from government officials their business would be harmed. People would not be buying fish and shrimp and shellfish from that region because they just had this image of the BP oil spill in those waters. And so, these fishermen are now concerned that their business is going to be jeopardized. Is this a valid concern?
Probably not, because tritium is extremely easy to monitor for. All forms of radiation are, and you can look at what you've caught and see. And there's a second part of this, which is tritium is only mildly radioactive, and it does not stay long in the human body or the body of the fish. The amount of tritium being added to the ocean is quite small relative to the amount that's already there. Tritium is created naturally by the interaction of solar radiation and water molecules. Essentially, it takes the hydrogen, the H in H2O, and makes it radioactive. It returns to stability after a few years. But it's not very radioactive. It doesn't stay in the body very long. So it's easy, if you look at what you've caught, to see if it has a higher tritium level. It will have a tritium level. Tritium is natural. It's always there. But it probably will not be elevated. In fact, it's hard to imagine how it could be elevated. There's tritium all over in the water you drink now. And this is simply the possibility of an addition to that, but it's unlikely to be any kind of addition.
And so despite the opposition by some, China as well, the government and the plant operator, Tokyo Electric Power Company Holdings, say that ultimately this water has to be removed to prevent any accidental leaks and make room for the plant's decommissioning. So the water staying there and not being released into the sea is also very dangerous.
I think some of the opposition from China and Korea are coming from traditional rivals of Japan. It's based on politics. It's not based on science or health. It's also true that there were a lot of contaminants in the water, but those have been filtered out. The difficulty with tritium is you can't filter it out. It is water. It's a form of water. And I would remind everyone, it's the least hazardous of radionuclides. It leaves the body quickly. It deteriorates later and turns into helium. Nuclear power plants in normal operation release small controlled amounts of tritium. These releases are also controlled. We know what's being released. We know when it's being released. It's not a health threat in normal operation. It's not a health threat now. And eventually you have to release some of this water. In the United States, we don't set limits on tritium except in drinking water. And I should point out, this is going into the ocean, which is not drinking water.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. Thank you so much for that analysis and helping us make sense of this. Matthew Wald, former policy analyst at the Nuclear Energy Institute from Washington, D.C. I look forward to speaking to you again very soon, Matthew. Thanks.
Thank you, Susan.
Well, the White House was briefly evacuated Sunday evening while President Biden was at Camp David. The Secret Service discovered, quote, suspicious powder in a common area of the West Wing, and law enforcement officials say that the initial test showed that the substance was cocaine. Secret Service agents were doing round routines when they found the white powder in an area accessible to tour groups, not in any particular West Wing office, they say. The White House was reportedly evacuated at about 8:45 p.m. on Sunday as fire and emergency crews were brought in to do a rapid test. The White House was soon reopened and the powder was sent for further testing. Biden and his family, including Hunter, his son, left for Camp David on Friday and returned to the White House on Tuesday. In a statement, the Secret Service said that the White House was closed as a precaution as emergency crews investigated. The District of Columbia Fire Department was called in to evaluate and determine that the substance was not hazardous. An investigation into the cause and manner of how the substance entered the White House is pending. In 2001, lethal anthrax arrived via a series of letters mailed to locations in Florida, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and Washington, D.C. It spread a new wave of panic across a nation that at that time was reeling from the terrorist attacks of 9/11 just weeks earlier. Russian Defense Ministry released a video showing long-range strategic bombers taking off and flying over the Bering Sea. The Tu-95MS aircraft performed a 13-hour flight over the neutral waters near the western coast of Alaska. As per the Russian Defense Ministry, Su-30SM and Su-35SM fighter jets escorted the Tu-95 bombers. The Tu-95 entered service with the Russian military in the 1950s and has since been extensively modernized. It is the world's fastest turboprop missile, carrier aircraft, and one of the components of the Russian nuclear triad. Putin continues to bank on the decades-old bombers. In case of a conflict, the enemy targets forward bases and carriers, and bombers are thus less exposed to an attack. Unlike high-performance tactical fighters, bombers can embark on long-distance missions. Large nuclear-capable bombers intimidate opponents and can also hunt down enemy warships. During the Cold War, Russia and the United States used to conduct long-range air patrols close to each other's airspace, but these dropped off as tensions eased. Around the year 2007, however, Vladimir Putin reinstated Russia's long-range air patrols, sending bomber fighters close to U.S., Japanese, and European airspace. A U.S. court restricted some officials and agencies of the Biden administration from meeting and communicating with social media companies to moderate content. The ruling marks a win for the conservative advocates who say that the Biden administration's used a pandemic and threat of misinformation as an excuse to censor or suppress content. The Democrats say that the ruling could seriously limit top government agencies from notifying the platforms about false, misleading, or problematic content. However, the judge made clear that there will be exceptions to national security issues and criminal activity. The order applies to a slew of top law enforcement agencies such as the Federal Bureau of Investigation, known as the FBI, the State Department, and the Justice Department. It also applies to health agencies, including Center for Disease Control and Prevention, and prominent officials such as White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre. A White House official said the Justice Department was reviewing the court's injunction and will evaluate its options. Some experts criticized the ruling, saying authorities needed to strike a balance between calling out falsehood and veering towards censorship or curbing free speech. Others called it government overreach. Canada, where rising wealth gap is a big worry for the country. Latest data suggests that the gap between rich and poor widened at the fastest pace between January and March of 2023. The latest data highlights a significant increase in the wealth gap between the richest and the poorest households. The wealth gap grew by 1.1 percentage points between January and March of 2023 compared to the same period in 2022. Now, that's the fastest increase since record keeping began in 2010. However, the wealth gap in the first quarter of 2023, which stood at 65.1 percentage points, remains slightly lower than it was in the first quarter of 2020, when it stood at 65.6 percentage points. Younger households have been hit the hardest. Households under the age of 45 make up 36.2% of the total households in Canada. And an overwhelming number of them are, well, poor. Data shows that immigration is the biggest reason for the rise in poorer younger households. What's more worrying is that the top 20% of households control a staggering 67.8% of Canada's net worth. The bottom 40% account for a mere 2.7%. Netflix has roped in Greta Gerwig, the director of the upcoming Hollywood flick Barbie, to helm the Chronicles of Narnia series. More details in our next report.
After Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, another popular fantasy novel, The Chronicles of Narnia is getting a series. In the early 2000s, these fantasy movie series dominated the theaters, with fans waiting outside ticket counters for hours to catch the first day, first show. Now, the Chronicles of Narnia novels are being adapted for Netflix. Barbie director Greta Gerwig has been roped in to helm the project. Reports suggest that Gerwig has a deal with the streaming service to write and direct at least 2 novels from C.S. Lewis's classic series. Lewis's series has been adapted in part before, with The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, Prince Caspian, and The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, which were released in 2005, 2008, and 2010 respectively. A 4th film was originally planned but never got materialized. Before Gerwig tackles the world of Narnia, her vision of the world's most famous doll will hit big screens later this month, with Margot Robbie playing Barbie alongside Ryan Gosling as Ken. Barbie will release in cinemas on July 21st. Bureau Report, WION World is One.
The United States celebrates its Independence Day on July 4th every year. It's tradition to gather with family and loved ones on this federal holiday, and it mostly ends with watching fireworks shows at night. Our next report gets you more on how the U.S. celebrates its Independence Day. Carlo Ancelotti is set to take up the reins as the head coach of Brazil, but first he will finish his contract with Spanish giant Real Madrid. The Italian will then join the 5-time champions next year in June for the Copa America. Brazilian Football Confederation president confirmed the news while appointing Fluminense boss Fernando Diniz as the manager for the next 12 months. 64-year-old Ancelotti will be in charge of a national team for the first time in his career. The closest Ancelotti came to coaching a national team was between 1992 and 1995, when he was an assistant to the legendary Italy manager Arrigo Sacchi. But he has a storied club career. He is the only manager to win the UEFA Champions Leagues 4 times, twice with AC Milan and twice with Madrid. He led Los Blancos to La Liga title in the 2021-2022 season, which made him the first manager to win the domestic league title in the top 5 European leagues. Brazil are without a head coach since Tite left the role after a quarter-final defeat to Croatia in the 2022 FIFA World Cup. Diniz will be at the helm till the time Ancelotti arrives next year.
It's a dream for anyone, an honor and an immense pride to serve Brazil's national team. I was called. It's very special the way it happened, the joint work between CBF and Fluminense. I'm convinced that we have everything to make this work well.